part 3, the vulnerability part. Okay, so let's look at how we can get adapted to the natural disasters induced by climate change by reducing the vulnerability. So we will examine two types of policies. First, how to build resilient houses or districts, and second, how to use natural disaster insurances. Okay, so the first idea is that you can try to build resilient districts or houses. When I say resilient, I mean places in which, okay, if there is a disaster, maybe you might endure some disagreements, like it may be complicated to exit the house, or maybe you will suffer from humidity a little bit, or things like this. But I mean, it won't be for a long time, and after the flood, then things will come back to normal, or almost. And so there are different ways to do this, and one way, which has been implemented in Netherlands, it's to build floating houses. So here on this picture you can see an example in Rotterdam, or here you can see an example in Amsterdam. And basically the idea is quite obvious. It's if you have a flood, then the houses will just float on top of the water, and all houses have a small boat, so the inhabitants can use the boat, and so when you have a flood, it's okay. Obviously there are several drawbacks. First, here again, the flood needs not to be too high, but I mean, it might be okay. And the second drawback is the fact that the price of these houses may be extremely high. For instance, here, the houses which were on these two pictures are actually really elusive houses which are quite expensive, and so such a solution may not work for all households. Let me take another example of, in this case, not for houses, but the example of a resilient neighborhood. So this example is close to Paris, in Vitry-sur-Seine, and around the station of Vitry-sur-Seine area, actually the whole area is prone to floods. And so there was a project of the redesign of this zone, and the project which was adopted is a project in which all the buildings do not start on the ground floor, but on the first floor. So it's something that you may see a little bit on this picture. So the buildings are not finished yet. It's really just an artist's view of the district. And basically all the buildings start on the first floor, and you have footways which are on the first floor. And so that even if there is a flood, if the flood is not too high, but the risk for a flood to be really high there is small. So if the flood is not too high, then you can still walk and across the district, and so it's okay for you. So here, for instance, you can see a map of the district with the Seine River, and here in red and oranges are represented the pedestrian highways. And so if there is a flood, from every building you can walk toward these pedestrian highways, and so it's okay in case of flood. So this is another example of a resilient district. Another way, which is complementary, actually it's not a replacement, to reduce our vulnerability to floods, is to use insurances. So here I won't spend much time explaining how work the insurances against floods, because it's a very complex subject. But let me just say that this subject is extremely important for what we will say after. This subject is extremely important to understand why people accept to live in flood-prone areas, or the incentives to live there. And it's also extremely important when you look at the economic consequences of natural disasters. Actually, if you compare the consequences of natural disasters in developed countries and in developing countries, you may know that the same natural disaster generally has much worse impact in developing countries than in developed countries in terms of both mortality and economic outcomes. And one of the reasons, especially if you look at the economic outcomes, one of the reasons is the fact that in developing countries, much fewer people have access to insurance. And so when they lose something because of natural disaster, generally it's a huge loss for them, and it's very difficult for them to recover after. Whereas in developed countries, you have had very strong policies to enable the inhabitants to have insurances against natural disasters. And so when you have a natural disaster, I mean, it's still bad for the people and so on, but I mean, the people don't lose everything. And so it's extremely important after for the recovery. And so since it's extremely important for the people to have such an insurance, generally, in almost every country, such insurances are backed by the states. Indeed, the problem is that if you know a little bit about insurance and how it works, natural disasters, as they affect a lot of people at the same time, they may be too risky for the private market. And so generally, private insurance firms are really reluctant to insure against natural disasters, or if they do it, it's for a high price, because for them it's a huge risk. So in most countries, in most developed countries at least, the state is backing up the system and is enabling natural disasters insurance to exist. For instance, if you look at what is happening in the UK, in the 50s, there was a gentleman's agreement between the state and private insurance companies, so that private sector would provide flood cover for almost all people in the country. In exchange, the state would make sure that almost all people in the country will be protected from floods by dikes. And it was an agreement, and the firms abided by the agreement. Later in the 90s, some strong floods occurred, and so the system changed a little bit, and nowadays the government has set up a fund which is called Flood Re, and the fund is owned and managed by the insurance industry, but basically, and it's there to provide insurance to the people who are the most at risk from floods. And the idea is that if there is an issue and if the fund is exhausted, then the state will come and give money to the fund. And the idea is that thanks to this, the private sector is accepting to provide insurance even to the most risky, to the houses most or to the activities most at risk, because they know that the state will help if there is an issue. In France, the system is quite different. Here again, you have the same idea, the idea of public insurance, but there the private system doesn't play such a big role. In this case, really, the natural disaster insurance is backed, is mostly organized by the state, and one of the consequences is that in France, each of you is paying actually an insurance for national disasters. It's part of the mandatory insurance that you have to pay for your home. But the price of the insurance is fixed by the state. So in UK, the price of the insurance is decided by the firms, but in France, the state decides for it, and the price is fixed regardless of the risk. So it means that in France, if you live in a flood-prone area or not, you pay the same price for the natural disaster insurance. So there are several advantages to this. So the coverture is very good in France for everybody. There are some notions of social justice included in this. However, there are several disadvantages. First, it's very costly for the state in case of disaster. And what is extremely important, there aren't many incentives for prevention by the people, because since everybody is paying the same price for the insurance, then there aren't too many incentives to protect your house. Obviously, generally people don't want to suffer from a disaster, so still they have incentives, but the incentives are lower than in some other countries in which you have to pay an extra price if you're living in a flood-prone area. So they're always poor and against arguments. There are many things that could be said on this. For instance, it might be a good idea, economically speaking, to enable people to live in flood-prone areas in some places, and we can discuss about this if you want in the course. And actually, the French system, a similar system as the French one, is, for instance, exists, for instance, in Spain or in New Zealand. But the key point here is that the key idea is that insurances against natural disasters are important, and generally they are backed up by the state, which means that the price of the insurance is not a good reflection of the risk, which is made for a lot of reasons. And it means that the risk alone is not well reflected in the price that the people have to pay, and it is one of the reasons which makes it difficult for people to be actually aware of the risk. And that's something that you will see in the next video about exposure to risk.